My name is Dr. Stephen Bujno. Welcome to St. Joseph's College, Maine's Catholic Moral Theology course. This is Unit 4, Lesson 8, Bioethics. We'll look at some principles, talk about some issues, and real briefly mention a couple emergent concerns. And we'll do this, as always, in consideration of the human person. You're well aware that bioethics here is literally a course in itself at St. Joseph's College, Maine, which I'm one of the instructors. So I'm not going to try to squeeze the whole course into this presentation. We're just going to cover the basics to give you an idea of the scope and the discipline of this study. But we will look at three principles: the principle of cooperation with evil, the principle of double effect, and the principle of proportionate and disproportionate care. Then, in a rather cursory fashion, we're going to look at various health care issues, reproductive technologies, procured abortion, mental health, and suffering and death. If you find yourself wanting more, please consider pursuing those interests within the bioethics course proper. Now, before we begin to delve into the bioethical principles, some comments from Evangelium Vitae. In 1995, John Paul II talked about many practices, and here he means abortion, contraception, etc., and how they're rooted primarily in a hedonistic mentality that's unwilling to accept responsibility in matters of sexuality. And they imply a self-centered concept of freedom. We've already covered that with regards to the procreation, which is seen as an obstacle to personal fulfillment. When you turn to sacred scripture, particularly Genesis 9:4, you recall that God the Creator asked Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" After this point, he had killed him. And Cain responds, "Am I my brother's keeper?" The answer is yes. This passage from sacred scripture brings to mind this notion of freedom, which exalts the isolated individual in some absolute way, gives no place for solidarity, no place for openness to others, nor service for them. Now, while it is true that the taking of a life not yet born, or in its final stages for some people, can be marked by some mistaken sense of altruism, they think they're doing good somewhere else, or human compassion. But it also cannot be denied that this creates a culture of death, and taken as a whole is founded on a completely individualistic concept of freedom, and it ends up simply becoming freedom of the strong against the weak, because the weak have no choice but to submit to the power of the strong. And if you recall from your presentation on Imago Dei, the human person here and always is foundational for all human activity in the moral realm. That may sound obvious to those within the body, but it's not obvious to the secular world. And in many ways, the human person, in secular settings, seems to exist for the economy and the created world, in a sense, existing just for the human person to use as they would wish. But this is not the same way as saying the human person is central. The human person is part of creation and contingent on God as the creator. And it's easy for the modern world, even for those who don't deny that fact, to lose the human person's transcendent nature. So John Paul II stated, when the sense of God is lost, the sense of the human person is also threatened and poisoned. As the Second Vatican Council concisely states, without the creator, the creature would disappear. But with God, or I should say when God is forgotten, the creature itself grows unintelligible. So man is really no longer outside of this relationship to see himself as mysteriously different from other earthly creatures, just part of it. He regards himself merely as one more living being, an organism, which at most maybe have reached some higher state of perfection. Enclosed in this very narrow horizon of his physical nature, he's somehow reduced to just being a thing, and no longer grasps the transcendent character of his own existence as the human person. Now, if this sounds sort of like vague at this point, the reality is that the human person, or the lack of understanding the human person, even if it exists in secular culture as a truncated view, can never really be suppressed entirely. To deny the transcendent aspect of the human person is, in a way, analogously trying to keep a beach ball under the water. It's eventually going to surface somewhere. That phenomenon here can be understood in terms of the euphemisms. So John Paul II, and what I mean by that, he speaks of this linguistic phenomena, which itself is literally, a euphemism becomes a symptom of the uneasiness of a person's consciousness, right? No word has the power to change the reality of things. So if we call something a procured abortion as the deliberate, and direct act of killing, it's not reproductive freedom. Whatever means this is carried out, a human person in their initial phase of their existence is snuffed out. So it's important that we call things by their proper names. Instead of abortion, using, in vitro fertilization, it's referred to as embryo reduction. Procured abortions are called terminated pregnancies. It's important that we recognize the moral object of exactly what's happening. Now, the morals, then, by which society forms these ethical decisions, and here we're speaking of bioethical determinations, the will of the scientific community, it often becomes accepted as protocol. And in the absence of backlash from the public, what happens is a utilitarian ethic simply forms. So again, John Paul II said in Evangelium Vitae, he argues that, democracy cannot be idolized to the point of making it a substitute for morality or a panacea for immorality. Fundamentally, democracy is a system, and as such is a means and not an end. So its moral value is not automatic. The majority cannot rule. It depends on conformity to the moral law, to which it, like every other form of human behavior, has to be subject. So the first and fundamental step towards this cultural transformation consists in forming our consciences with regard to the incomparable and inviolable worth of every human individual. It is of the greatest importance, I should say, to reestablish this essential connection between life and freedom. All right. Beginning with some concepts here, let's just, in a real brief way, mention what is the goal of healthcare and what is the goal of bioethics that it regulates. And I guess I should back up a minute and say something like this. The bioethicists and bioethical principles are not the moral police of medical professionals, because they're not there to check every action to make sure that it's in line with some sort of ethical value system. If the goal of a medical professional is to be as free as possible, and we understand that, again, to do that which they were designed to do, then the bioethicists and medical principles are there to help the medical professional be free. So although curing is certainly a goal within it, the idea of health and well-being sort of transcend that. So even individuals with chronic illnesses, perhaps even terminal illnesses, could have a sense of both health and well-being. And the reason why it's bioethics is because some sort of ethical system has to be brought to bear on this. There is no default ethic, or if there is, it's probably utilitarian, where people will egotistically just search for their own gain over something. But the reality is that some ethic has to surface and has to be applied, and then it has to be applied consistently. That's one of the goals of principles, which are, in by their nature, very general. Now, when we talk about cooperation with evil, the reason why this, and I'll say what it is and then I'll explain exactly how we understand it. Even Catholic hospitals are never just self-standing. We always live in this broad network of relations. And it is impossible for us to move throughout the day without, in some way, cooperating with evil. For instance, we have some concern over perhaps the clothing we buy, the sneakers we buy, how are these produced. We talk about fair trade goods. We don't want to buy clothing from sweatshops. We don't want to support people who are using illicit means to make those things that perhaps we need or even desire. So what we find ourselves sometimes are in unavoidable circumstances where there is nothing we can do but cooperate with the evil in order to do some good through it. That isn't saying that we accept it. It's just saying that there's no other way for us to move through this particular, an analysis of whatever it is that we're looking at. So we all have to live in the world. And in this broad, network and realm of ideas, the human person is still an element that contributes to the wider culture, and then this wider culture, in turn, contributes to the formation of the human person. So we, though, personally, are responsible for the good or evil that we do ourselves. So there are times where we just cannot participate in the evil that might be evident in society or in that particular realm. So we find ourselves in these situations where we may or may not cooperate with evil, and it has to depend on certain circumstances. But the extent to which one cooperates, whether or not one shares, that well determines whether or not one shares, and then also to what degree one shares in the responsibility for doing it, promoting it, participating in, and such. So remember the primary precept of morality, to do good and avoid evil. It always must be followed. But there are certain situations where participation in evil could be morally licit. That may sound odd, that a participation in an evil can be morally licit, but I'll explain. Now, to do those things, though, in certain situations, that's not to be understood as exceptions. For example, if we were to ask, is it licit for a banker to give loans to those who are unable to repay? There may not be an easy answer to that. Or for an assistant to set up the appointment for the person who could not pay. Or for an investor to invest funds in companies who exploit other people or maybe exploit the environment. Is it illicit to charge what the market can bear? That's basic principle of secular economics. These could be things for either that are required by law for people to have, like certain insurances, or are they necessary for an adequate life? So even like, say, home and health insurance. Or how about those hostile takeovers that liquidate companies for profit? Or that pay executives these enormous fees while the average worker struggles? Now, those aren't bioethical principles, but I'm just trying to give some analogies on how, this is the stuff that's going all around us, and we have to determine at what point do we draw the line. So in bioethics now, is it licit to work as a nurse participating in abortion, or to work on the same hospital wing where abortions are going? Or how about to be the engineer who keeps the mechanicals of an abortion clinic working properly, the furnace and the air conditioning units? Or how about the taxi driver that drops the woman off at Planned Parenthood? So we can go on and on. So the goal here is to determine at what point does one's faith not allow cooperation with that evil? And to what extent should a person exhibit courage and then take a stand? This is when we apply the principle of cooperation with evil. So what I have provided here is a diagram that Father Ted from the National Catholic Bioethics Center has kind of approved when I took a few classes there. Because if you're like me, I do better when I see something visual. So what I'm going to do is I'll explain this diagram, and then perhaps we can apply something to it. So first, cooperation with evil falls into two broad categories, and in each with subcategories. So the first category, to your left, is formal cooperation. So in formal cooperation, those are people who share the intention and they concur with the evil act that's being done. The other is material cooperation. So they do not share in the intention and they do not concur with the evil being done. Now, formal cooperation is always illicit, meaning it's always evil. Though, there are two categories within formal cooperation. There's formal explicit, which is an act that does so for its own sake. For example, an abortion doctor or a nurse who is cooperating with the abortion and thinks the abortion is good. There's also formal implicit, which is an act that does so for some other good. So this would be an abortion doctor or perhaps a nurse who's cooperating with the abortion, but they're doing it primarily because they need the income. Okay, so each of these, anything that falls under formal, would be illicit. Now, material cooperation is often, but not always, illicit. So this is where we might see something that's not an exception, but simply an act that's permitted. Now here too, there are two categories. So the first one is material immediate cooperation. This type of cooperation, it's essential to the act. For example, a nurse who's operating the suction unit during an abortion, but may think abortion is wrong personally, but they're doing it for some other good. They need the money, the health care. But with material immediate, overall, the participation is not essential to the act. It's known as either proximate immediate material, and it would be proximate immediate material if participation has a direct influence and it's ordered to an act, but they do not concur. So, for example, a person drives their friend to Planned Parenthood specifically to have an abortion. It's determined remote immediate material if the participation has an indirect influence and is not ordered to an act. A nurse works in the wing of a hospital where abortions are performed, or perhaps a cab driver takes a woman to Planned Parenthood. See, unlike the friend, they really don't know what the person is going there for and what their goal is. So there's a lot that could be said on this topic within this course, but just two quick things here, right? Well, maybe I should just back up a second and say something more about this. The way that you phrase the cooperation is by starting at the bottom of the diagram and working up. So if a person concurred with the abortion, but was there only for the money, we would say that person is implicit formal cooperation with evil. If the person is driving their friend to an abortion, we would say that is proximate mediate material cooperation with evil. If you're a cab driver simply, or an Uber driver simply dropping somebody off at Planned Parenthood where they could be there for other reasons, we would say that is remote mediate material cooperation with evil. Remote mediate material cooperation with evil is the only level of cooperation here that we would say is licit. If I had more time, I would work this out with the use of the vaccinations for the COVID, because this is one of the concepts that is used to help us apply there. But nonetheless, much can be said. If you want to demonstrate this by example, make sure you use, like if you're going to try to do your own example of cooperation with evil, you're going to have to use a simple scenario. That doesn't mean that this cannot be used in complex cases. It just simply means that there are a lot of circumstances that are going to change the licitness of this act, and it can become very confusing if you're trying to explain this to somebody else. So keep it simple. The second is, though, even though remote mediate material cooperation with evil may be licit, one should always consider the presence of scandal, which is to say that no one should really cause public confusion about Catholic teaching or identity, particularly if it's a Catholic healthcare institution. Okay. Another principle is the principle of double effect. Now, this was first introduced by Thomas Aquinas in his explanation of self-defense. Now, there are times when an action that is good in itself has at least two effects, an intended and an attainable good effect, and an unintended yet a foreseen evil effect. So you intend the good, you foresee the evil, you don't intend the evil, but you do realize it's going to happen. What this is referring to here is that a principle based on this clash between the norms, do good and to avoid evil. What happens if, by doing good, evil still happens? This doesn't mean you're doing you're doing evil in order for good to happen. This means that you're doing good and recognize that evil will still happen in spite of that. Now, certain criteria have been developed, and there are four. Maybe I should just back up here a little bit and say how Thomas Aquinas came about this. If somebody were to break into your house and threaten you, your family, or such, and you had to use proportionate force, say that they had a knife or something, and you had to use a firearm to stop them, and in the process of that, you killed them. Ordinarily, killing another person is an evil, but the moral object there was self-defense. So the proportion between their life and yours was equal. Thomas Aquinas says in this case, double effect works. Now, an interesting thing about double effect is that even if you were to take secular medical ethics, this is taught, and they properly attribute the Catholic Church and Thomas Aquinas. This usually falls under the principle of non-maleficence, do no harm. But nonetheless, and again, in secular medical ethics, this criteria is utilized. So here are the criteria, there's four. The action itself must be good or indifferent, so it cannot be intrinsically evil. That would need to be worked out in a secular situation. The second is the good effect cannot be attained through the bad effect, because that would be consequentialism. And there must be proportion between the good and the bad, right? So you can't, you could not do, say, some sort of plastic surgery operation just for, something cosmetic on an individual who's pregnant, because if it were to destroy the unborn, that is not proportionate to the cosmetic gains of the human person, right? It'd have to be something that's, evened out, we should say. And then the fourth one is the intention of the subject must be directed towards the good. The bad effect is undesired but tolerated. So the good effect, sometimes it's said, will not flow from the bad effect. So let's keep for an example, and I'll give you a few here, some simple scenarios. Let's say a woman is dying and is in severe pain, and the normal dosage of pain relievers that are given, they don't seem to be sufficient. So the minimum effective dosage the physician determines will hasten the impending death. So the woman is given sufficient dose in order to reduce the pain, but does die sooner than otherwise expected. So what exactly is the moral object? What are we doing? The first principle is administering the pain-relieving drugs. That's good. What is the second? Well, the good effect, which is the pain relief, that was not obtained through the bad effect, death. So that too is licit. The third, there was a proportion between the good, which is undoing the intolerable pain, and the bad effect, death. Those seem to be lined up. And the fourth, the intention of the subject to relieve the pain, and the bad effect, the impending death, was simply merely tolerated in order to achieve the prior. So, because, and all four of these have to be good. If any one of them is illicit, then the whole thing is, because of that one defect, also not licit. So I'll give you two more examples on the topic of a foreseen death in an unborn child. The first one will be licit moral, and the second one illicit immoral. So if a woman is diagnosed with an aggressive form of uterine cancer early in her pregnancy, and it's told that not only will she not survive otherwise, but she could be licitly treated even if the results would wind up in the death of the unborn child. So what is the object here? The object of the act is the removal of the diseased organ. So you're removing the uterus. The second, the bad effect, which is the death of the unborn, it's foreseen, but that's not intended. If you had some power, you would obviously not allow it to happen. The third, the healing of the cancer, isn't the result of the death of the child. It's the result of the removal of the organ. And fourth, it's proportionate good. The life of the mother is certainly equal to the life of the child, even if the life of the child is sacrificed in this regard. Now, contrarily, though, if a pregnant woman, say, had hypertension, which is simply aggravated by pregnancy, now I realize how serious this can be, so we're going to have to say that this is not, this is only a concern and not something that's going to put the woman's physical life into imminent danger. We'll say that this is occurring prior to viability. If the child is voluntarily aborted, then the act is illicit, immoral. So here's the breakdown. If in that case the object of the act is the abortion of the unborn child, that's an intrinsic evil. The bad effect, the death of the unborn child, is not just foreseen, it's intended, even if it's not the only intention. And the healing of the hypertension is a direct result of the death of the child. And there does remain some proportionate good, the life of the mother and the death of the child, but we'd have to determine exactly was the life of the mother on the line here, or simply just a concern. So I realize that this would take, again, more to delve into. If we were in a class, we can bat things back and forth. I just wanted to offer you some insight into the principle of double effect and how it's useful in determining the licit or the illicitness of a human act. Now, when we talk about the principle of proportionate and disproportionate care, here, well, we'll stay with that. Here, these terms are often used synonymously with ordinary and extraordinary. At least they used to be. So the reason why it went from ordinary and extraordinary to proportionate and disproportionate is that ordinary became to be understood as simply things that we ordinarily do, and extraordinary things that are outside of what we ordinarily do. Proportionate and disproportionate just simply hit the button a little closer to try to distinguish exactly what these things are trying to ferret out. So nonetheless, when we use these terms, proportionate and disproportionate, in applying this principle, we have to consider what is a reasonable hope of benefit for the patient as a whole person. So we're not just looking, although we are looking, not just looking at psychological, but it has to include the patient's personal, their financial, their familial, and all their social circumstances. Those are important factors too. Nothing is, how can you say, nothing is unlimited, correct? So to understand these terms, first is that proportionate has this meaning that in the given circumstances there's a reasonable hope of benefit, and it's not too burdensome for the patient or the others. So that's how you understand proportionate. Reasonable hope of benefit, not too burdensome. Disproportionate is the converse, right? In this given circumstances, the treatment, either offers no reasonable hope or benefit, or it's too burdensome for the patient. Now, this is applied through the entire range of medical treatment options, right? So the extraction of a tooth rather than a root canal procedure, moving to another region, perhaps due to one's asthma condition, terminal conditions, the DNR orders. And it might be best here to offer some characteristics that arise. Perhaps it's an easier way to look at this if we apply to end-of-life care rather than work through specific simple scenarios. So the application often determines the distinction between natural death and euthanasia, if we're trying to figure out what's the distinction between allowing somebody to die and causing the death. If some treatment, offers minimal known success, in other words, it's going to extend one's life perhaps 3 to 6 months, but the cost of the treatment is exuberant, $200,000. It can be considered disproportionate care and withheld. That's a burden to put on the family and the healthcare system for a very little return, if you want to say it that way. And if a person has grown tired, say, of even multiple dialysis treatments every week, or over a very long period of time, it's wearing on them. If that burden causes them, think of all the factors that are involved in this. The traveling, just how mobile is the person, for one. This could be determined disproportionate. So I don't want to give more examples, but a person in that care could say, I no longer want to receive dialysis. I'll accept the finality of my life. Now, some things that this does not apply to would be like ANH, which is artificial nutrition and hydration, because nutrition and hydration may have to be given in a medical facility, but they're not medical care. They're not medicines, so they cannot be withheld morally, even though there are instances when even administering artificial nutrition and hydration is not feasible. There could be constant infections, the inability to assimilate that, the port maybe, and such. Nonetheless. Now, as we move away from these three principles and we start looking at healthcare issues, rather than spend a real length of time each, I want to only give you just some broad statements on what I have found of interest to students in the classroom over the years. And I found them also useful in helping to explain the Catholic Church's teaching in regards to each of these. So without being too expansive, I hope you find them useful, because we could spend hours on just each of these. I'll talk about reproductive technologies. So anything that helps or aids the function of a system or an organ is typically morally permissible within Catholic bioethics. So a strictly therapeutic intervention, like concerning like human embryos, whose explicit objective is the healing of various maladies such as those stemming from chromosomal defects, will in principle be considered desirable, provided it is directed to the true promotion of the personal well-being of the individual without doing harm to his integrity or worsening his conditions of life. So John Paul II there in Donum Vitae, if there were some way to treat either the embryo or the unborn, where you're talking about the restoration of a function, whether it be the chromosomal defect or such, provided that it's just a restoration, it's licit. On the other hand, it sometimes happens that a medical procedure technology replaces the conjugal act. Here we could think of vitro fertilization, in order to obtain a procreation which is neither a result nor its fruit. In that case, the medical act is not, as it should be, at the service of the conjugal union, but rather it appropriates to itself the procreative function, and thus it contradicts the dignity and inalienable rights of the spouses of the child to be born. Now, nobody would try to doubt the intentions of people who, and let's just say the horrible struggle of those who have infertility issues. But let's be clear on what ethic we're putting forth here. It would be purely consequential, utilitarian, to say that I will use whatever means in order to achieve this end. So, this is the issue. If it is tragic for a couple, a tragic state of affairs for a couple not to be able to have children, we know the pain and sorrow that arises from many failed attempts, right? So when a couple turns to some illicit fertility procedure, we should realize, not just pastorally but intellectually, this is out of desperation, and the intention is there. But what needs to be considered are two things. One is, not every result of our fallen world can be overcome. So the fact that this is even an issue is because of the tragic situation all of us humans live in. It is true that there may have been many advances in fertility treatments, But simply being able to assist does not mean that it's morally illicit to do so, right? To think otherwise, again, we're falling back in a utilitarian attitude. Now, this doesn't reduce the dignity of any child born. So if a child born of IVF, nothing is reduced, fully human, right? We should also be happy for the child's existence and the couple's parenthood. But that doesn't extend to approving the means. Underneath this attitude is that that there is something, non-expressed. And what is non-expressed is that the child is start to be looked as the product of the parents. Now I want to be careful on how I frame this, because it's the parents see that they have some sort of right to have a child. We have the desires to have a child. You can't have a right over somebody else. And I realize hardly any couple would ever express it like that. Perhaps it would take me more to explain the underlying attitude another time. But it's not Christian to think or to say that every couple was meant to have children, because that is not what I personally or we would believe. But it is the reality is that not all families will have children, and it's not. It's never something that simply should be lived with. These are just tragic situations, and we have no idea how God will call them to express, those couples that are unable to have children, to express their nurturing, parental abilities in some other way: adoption, foster children, care for the family members, other family members, etc. But those are ways that God could and use the loving gifts that they have. I would not ascribe that to God's will. So let me say something about that. It's often said, because it rolls off the tongue rather sweet, that everything has a purpose. Well, my goddaughter had infant cancer at 8 months old. What is the purpose for that? I'd rather say that all things happen in our fallen world, and we do what we can using illicit means to overcome them, but we cannot use any means to overcome them. So in terms of reproductive technologies, it is very true that it is tragic that some parents simply cannot seem to become pregnant. But there's something that stops once you start seeing it in terms as we have the right to pursue this in which any way we want, technologically speaking. I'm going to leave it there only because it would take a lot more to iron some of that out. When I talked about the utilitarian ethics, and I said that one of the problems with it is that you cannot foresee all the consequences, I want to bring one of those up here. Cryogenically frozen embryos are the result of in vitro fertilization. Sometimes they call them spares, so there you go with another euphemism, right? Dona Vitae states, in consequence of the fact that they have been produced in vitro, so these were sperm and ovum that were in a petri dish, fertilized. These embryos, which are not transferred into the body of the mother, are called spare, and they're exposed, says Dona Vitae, to an absurd fate with no possibility of their being offered safe means of survival which can be illicitly pursued. Much can be said on that. For this presentation, I'm going to leave it at that. I want to say one other thing about this, though. I go into much depth in the bioethics course, is that typically back in 1978 or such, when the so-called test tube baby was first born, they worked within the woman's natural cycle. So one ovum was harvested and then mixed with sperm and implanted, and then perhaps it didn't take. Now they give hormones for the woman to hyperovulate, so they may, it depends, but they could fertilize 5 to 8 or so embryos. They then would implant 2 to 3. If more than one took and the mother did not want them, then another euphemism, they would do selective reduction, which is really an abortion, to not stress the mother's body, thus place her in physical peril. But they don't just choose these embryos by random. The health of the embryo and pre-genetic testing and such is done. So I don't mean to sound crass, but if a same-sex lesbian couple wanted to go to a sperm bank, they would not say, I'll take whatever. They want to know some history, be it medical, psychological, intellectual aspects of the donor of the sperm. The same goes for the embryos. Pre-genetic testing is going to determine whether or not there are any abnormalities. Is this child going to be a cystic fibrosis carrier, a Down syndrome? I won't go into all the things here, but do you see a little more benign view of genetics entering in here, eugenics entering in here again? In other words, there's some selection going on. So this is sort of like what Malthus had talked about, in the same way that cattle and such could be bred for selectively. Perhaps that's true for humans. Just think in terms of power. Who's going to be the one that chooses on this? Anyway, if we talk about now procured abortion, we're distinguishing this from spontaneous abortions, which are typically referred to as miscarriages. Though it's true, miscarriages could be culpable, or people could be guilty of them if it's because or due to neglect or abuse. But we're going to stay clear of those in our evaluation here. Here, in the scope of the issue, let's just lay this out so we know exactly what we're talking about. And these figures do change. Nearly 2,700 children are aborted every day in the United States by abortion. That's 112 every hour. That's about 977,000 a year, and it has been 39 million since abortion was legalized in 1972. Now, contraception is often thought to be the solution. So you might hear somebody, we don't need to have as many abortions if more people went on contraception. But if you go to the Alan Guttmacher Institute, so Alan Guttmacher was a past president of Planned Parenthood. Actually, he followed, if I remember correctly, Margaret Sanger. So the Alan Guttmacher Institute, collects all the data about this. And interestingly enough, 51% of women who have had abortions used some sort of contraceptive method during the month they became pregnant. So maybe the argument now could be, well, they weren't using it properly. Well, okay, but that's not the same as saying all we need is contraception, is it? It makes a weak argument, is all I'm trying to say, to simply say contraception use will lower the number of abortions. It hasn't been proven. Anyway, now as to why women have abortions, again, according to the Alan Guttmacher Institute, 74% say that the child would interfere with their work, school, or other responsibilities. 73% say, well, they cannot afford to have a child. 48% say, well, I don't want to be a single parent, or they have relationship problems with the father. Only less than 2% say because of the result of rape or incest. And I want to say something about that. Incest has literally nothing to do with this. If it is not consensual, it is rape. And the incestual aspect of it is just part of the qualification of the non-consensual sexual act. There is consensual incest. So we're not talking about that. That word is something thrown in there to pollute the conversation a little bit more. But we'll leave it at that, because extremes are often used as scare tactics, even if there are rare exceptions. All right. Now, I want to say something here about the Supreme Court rulings. I realize that, we are in the midst of Roe v. Wade perhaps being overturned, which I guess I could say up front that it may not be the win that most people think it is, because that will throw it back to the states, and it could be that legislators put forth, or perhaps even a court hearing will come to the Supreme Court that does not place it underneath the right to privacy, but actually defines it directly as the right to abortion. So nonetheless, I'm not going to comment any further on that. But the two cases that we're most familiar with, the first one is Roe v. Wade. That's known by all. That came across in 1973. Now, that was filed on behalf of Norma McCorvey. She was Jane Roe. She was poor and falsely claimed to have been raped in 1970, because she later repudiated her participation in this. Henry Wade was the Attorney General for Texas. So Roe invalidated laws in all 50 states. But it was poorly argued because there were jumps in logic. So basically, in the first trimester, the abortion decision is left to the medical judgment of the pregnant woman's attending physician. And then for the second trimester, the abortion procedure may be considered in ways that are reasonably related to maternal health. And then by the third trimester, the preservation of the life or the health of the mother will override any abortion restrictions. So the court there understood viability as 26 weeks, which was thought of as the ability of the fetus to exist outside of the mother's womb. So here what you should know is that, this was an extrinsic standard was used to measure personhood, outside of the womb. So the right to abortion was absolute until viability, virtually absolute thereafter, provided the life of the mother was at stake. Now, that brings us to a lesser known case that actually came on the very same day as Roe v. Wade, and that was Doe v. Bolton. So Doe v. Bolton, this Doe was Sandra Cano, who had not known the case was filed on her behalf. I mean, every legal case has to be filed on somebody's behalf. They themselves do not have to know that it's them. So there were subsequent appeals, but once she learned of the fact, which she didn't learn until 2003, when it reached the U.S. Supreme Court, her motion to reopen the case had been denied. So under the pseudonym Mary Roe, to allegedly protect her identity, lawyers sued on Arthur Bolton, who was the Attorney General of Georgia, who represented Georgia law that would not permit an abortion after 24 weeks. So what I'm trying to make you aware of with the Doe v. Bolton is the so-called health clause. So when you or I typically use life of the mother, we think we're talking about life or death. But life of the mother does not mean, or doesn't only mean, I should say, imminent physical death. It's really up to the medical judgment that may be exercised in light of all factors. So it could be physical, it could be emotional, it could be that the woman's going to have psychological issues, it could be that they have familial issues, it could be that the woman's older. All of those things constitute what we normally know as life. So when you hear somebody say, particularly a politician, that they won't even give exceptions for the life of the mother, you're going to have to explain or ask, what do you mean by life of the mother? Because it's in Doe v. Bolton, it meant all of those things. All of those factors relate to health. So I want to give you a rational argument against abortion. You probably know the church's teaching and some of the biblical passages, but those are only going to hold force to very devout Catholics, and maybe not even all Catholics, or biblical if somebody will hold the same biblical interpretation as you do. What I'm going to do is I want to explain abortion in light of these three terms: life, human, and personhood. Now, any moral or ethical treatment always follows from being. So being is what a thing is. If you don't know what a thing is, then you can't even talk about what is good for that thing. So killing or murder, it's a moral judgment based on being. So if you ask somebody, is it ethical to kill? Like if you were just to say, look, is it ethical to kill what's in the next room? And don't worry about why they're allowed to do this, just say that they are allowed to do it. If the first thing they don't ask is what is it, then that's concerning, right? So if you say, well, it's a cockroach, they're not going to care. If you say it's a mouse, they may not care. If you say it's a bunny rabbit, they're going to be concerned. If you say it's a baby, they're going to say, what are you doing? So the point is that every moral judgment, every moral treatment, it always stems from that initial question of what is the thing. One cannot proceed without answering that ontological question. So if somebody says, I don't know when life begins, well, then your only option is to do nothing. That would be like saying, I'm the one that has to give the all clear before we collapse a building to make way for a parking lot. And somebody says, is there any living being in it? And you say yes, and don't answer what it is. I mean, it's one thing if it's just a rat running around. It's another thing if there's a human person in there. So it doesn't quite add up logically when somebody argues that. Now, somebody might say, well, it's not necessarily a life. It's only a potential life. Now, the reality is that life begins when two haploid cells emerge. Well, I should even put it this way. Life doesn't even necessarily begin at that point, because life is not spontaneous generation, right? The reality is that the ovum is alive and so is the sperm. And when the ovum come together and form this new gametic material, that too is alive. It does not die in between, all right? So the reality is that, and you're going to hear my critique of the Catholic Church's slogan, pro-life. I don't think that's a very good slogan to use, because we should not be talking about life. It's also a bad slogan to say pro-choice, because it doesn't tell you that the choice is about what particular ontological aspect of a being. But nonetheless, when we say that something is alive, once these cells fuse, we do have new gametic material. This is unique genetic code. This is simple and plain. This is biology. This isn't even theology or philosophy. This is simply biology. It can't be a potential life. If you say it's a potential life, then what is it now? It's not dead. Life is not some, well, it's almost alive. It's either alive or it's not alive, right? So if it's a life, we're going to say, is it a human life? Well, people can't say it's a potential human, right? So human is also a biological classification. The reality is that we may struggle. It's called the species problem to determine exactly what is or is not a human, but nobody goes to the zoo and is confused between the giraffe, the chimpanzee, and the human person who is viewing them through the cage. So human and life are biological and quantifiable aspects that we should not even be talking about. This whole thing boils down to personhood. It is the only question that should be debated, because what abortion depends only on somebody's view of personhood. In fact, I will say it this way, and I'll say it this clearly. Abortion boils down, whether you're for or against it, to one thing, one question, I should say. Can you conceive of a living human that is not a person? If you say yes, then you could be for abortion. If you say no, then you cannot be for abortion. There's really no other way to go for this. So let me expand this a little bit farther and give you another 2 minutes on metaphysics. I have a diagram. This ought to be easy. When you hear the term potential, and it shows up quite a bit in this issue, let me explain philosophically what potential means. So when we say that something is actual, we are referring to the perfection of the thing. Potentiality is the power within the thing. To say that something is potential isn't to say that it's possible. It's to say that that's the power within it. So potentiality is not something possible, it's its only future. So what that means is that something that has potentiality, it cannot become anything. So we couldn't say it's a potential human because it doesn't have the potentiality to become a giraffe. It's human. The only thing that lies in front of it is not its nature. So it's not the nature that's potential, it's just the expression that's potential. And when it's reached its potential, then we say it has become actual. So now, that may sound convoluted, but here's how easy this is to understand. If we're holding an acorn, we say that is its actuality. What is the potentiality within the acorn to become a sapling? Once we have a 3-foot sapling, that is its actuality. What is the potential within the sapling? To become a tree. When we have the actual tree, now the potentiality that was there in the acorn has been totally actualized. Those are the accidents, the acorn, the sapling, and the tree. It looks differently. That's what accidents are, not having a mistake. It's those things that are not essential to the nature. But it's always been an oak. An acorn is not going to become a tomato plant. That's it. The same thing is here with a fetus. When you have a fetus, doesn't matter if it's an embryo or it doesn't matter if it's 22 weeks in utero. You have an actual fetus. Its potentiality is not human or life. Its potentiality is that one day its future will be toddler, and that's its only future. It could be that it's never realized, but it's its only future. Once you have a toddler, its potentiality becomes to be that of an adult. And when you have an adult, you have the actual adult, which is the realized potential of the toddler. But just like the acorn, the sapling, and the tree always held the essence of oak, the fetus, the toddler, and the adult always hold the essence of human. The only thing that has changed are the accidents, the non-essential features of the human person. So, with that being said, what exactly is the concern? The concern in this argument is not whether it's a life or whether it's a human, but is it a person? And if you're going to say that I cannot conceive of a living human that's not a person, then it's a person from the moment of fertilization. If you're going to say I can conceive of living humans that are persons that are not persons, you're not out of the woods. Now you have to say when. So when would it be? Is it at the heartbeat? That could be 6 to 7 weeks gestation. Is it brain activity? Depending on what's considered brain activity, it could be electroactivity in the 5th week or development of the cerebrum, perhaps by week 10 or even farther down the line. How about movement, which typically is around 16 weeks? I want to stop there, and I want to say something about this. If you hear somebody say that the Catholic Church has changed its position on abortion because they accept abortion up until 16 weeks, which is typically quickening or you feel movement, that's because it's an anachronistic understanding of how fertilization worked, which nobody really knew. What was thought was that semen, which literally is Latin for seed, contained all of the necessary material for the human person, and the woman was simply the fertile womb. Now, that may sound odd to us, but that's how we plant things in the garden. We put the tomato seed in the ground, and then it grows a tomato. So until there was some sort of animation, there was no sense that a soul existed. The word anima is the Latin word for soul, hence the word animation. So it was thought that once this animation occurred, then the soul entered, and at that point, it was illicit, always and everywhere, to have an abortion. So for somebody to say that the Catholic Church now says it's fertilization, when they used to say it was 16 weeks, the only thing that changed was their understanding of science and how fertilization works. That's it. So it's a very bad argument on their part. Nonetheless, where else would we talk about this? Pain sensitivity? That's somewhat controversial. Neurons develop early on in 6 weeks, but it could be 20 weeks until the child actually feels pain. Or how about viability, which is down to 22 weeks now? And we don't know how this is going to go in the future. It could be that if viability becomes some sort of marker, and as technology gets better and better, it could be that number keeps going down. But the survival rate, even at 22 weeks, is not perfect, right? You could be talking, the percentages go up from 35% to 90%, depending on the month there. Or how about birth, which is where we look at legal personhood, right? So as soon as the head has evacuated the vaginal cavity, then therefore, or if it's breech, I believe it's the point where the unborn's navel clears. So at that point then, are we talking personhood? Even atheist philosophers find that to be an extremely strange way to clarify when a person becomes a person. Right now, I'm not here addressing maternal autonomy. I wish I had more time because I would talk respectfully for that. But I'm limited on what I can do here. But I want to assign one more condition that you're going to have to consider as far as when we become persons. Now, there's another criteria. Now, notice this is all criteria or values that we put on the individual. So we're determining that nobody's a person until you have, this level of brain activity, until you have this level of pain sensitivity. What about consciousness? By consciousness, I mean that the child is aware that they exist separate from the world. That's roughly 5 to 6 months post-utero, so this is after birth. Now, the Princeton philosopher Peter Singer, he's an advocate for using the marker of self-awareness for personhood. So what this means is that up until 5 or 6 months of age, the child can be aborted post-birth. Now, we would call that infanticide, but we only call it infanticide because even the secular world considers that to be a person. But what if it is not a person until there is self-consciousness? Then there's no difference between the 3-month-old in terms of personhood compared, say, to the 3-month gestational child in utero. So that may sound horrible, and it should, right? But do you honestly think that that person is not being consistent? In other words, that is a solid criteria, and then they're used to using that at the end of life too. When a person loses consciousness, then again, you're not there as a person. So people in a permanent vegetative state, we already say things like they're not really there. He's just trying to say this is why we say that there's no longer that individual. So the point is to be consistent in our theological and philosophical approach. When is a human life determined person? You apply your principle of personhood, in the case of abortion, to the end of life. That may help. Now, maybe I should say something about a woman having a right to her body. Now, first of all, bodily autonomy is an important feature, not just for women, but for men. But the reality is that, I'll use this phrase and to quick explain it. Ontology precedes autonomy. Ontology is what a thing is. That has to come first, not because I want it to. It has to come first before autonomy. And here's how you would explain that. Even a woman's autonomy, it stops at the threshold of another person. So no person can harm another innocent just because of their own bodily autonomy. So whether or not an unborn is a human person has to be determined first before you can actually talk about whether or not the woman has autonomy over that, because nobody has autonomy over another person, even in secular medical ethics. But even a person with bodily autonomy, they can't self-harm, you can't sell organs, so there are many things here that still are in conflict with bodily autonomy that don't simply attach to the abortion issue. So when we say that one person has a right to their own body, it never extends to the harm of another person. And if somebody follows up by saying, yeah, but the unborn is not a person, okay, then when does it become a person? You're compelled to say. So you have to get this all right. You have to stop saying we're talking about life. You have to stop saying we're talking about human. We're just talking about person. And how do you know it becomes a person? If they say it's at birth, that's an odd way. Although I do understand, that there is something that's quite clearly where the child is dependent on the mother physically. Though, there's another way to say this. If you were to if a person who was adamantly for abortion and for women's bodily autonomy, if they walked into a room and there was nobody else in that room and there was a 2-week-old infant lying on the floor, they would not leave that 2-week-old infant lying on the floor and claim that they have no right and justice to take care of that child because it's not something that's of their concern. So we have to be careful too that we don't disentangle this from other virtues. Anyway, there's a lot that we can do to talk about this, but I'll leave it at that. Suffering and death and euthanasia. Now, when we talk about suffering and death, these are mysteries. So let's go back to the mysteries and problems, right? Our suffering is not a punishment for personal sins. And, perhaps where our sins have caused consequences, but that's even not really a punishment, it's a result of our actions. And death for the secular world, this is the ultimate evil, right? You cease to exist. So for the Christian, death remains a mystery. And although it's an end to this life, it's not an end to the individual's existence. In other words, it's not an end to personhood. Dying, we should know, is a process. And death is an event, because it can actually occur over time. So, defined, death can be complete and irreversible cessation of all brain activity with moral certainty, right? We're talking whole brain death, not just some higher functions. Now, the definition is a little bit vague. What does it completely mean? Does it mean the entire brain, or does it mean just the cerebral hemispheres? And what do we mean by irreversible? Is irreversibility can only be ascertained from prior experiences? How do you do this? I mean, typically they would do apnea tests, multiple, over a couple of days, pain infliction, dilation and such. But I should say something about this. Remember how I said every time that you want to change something, you must change the definition? Well, the reality is that the EEGs and everything else they use to try to determine whole brain death, there have been people who have been declared whole brain dead and have come back. It's not that frequent, and it's not as though they see themselves floating above the table, but they come out of it and they explain everything that's going on, which means is that there might be residual aspects of consciousness that reside in areas of the brain that are not being properly measured through the EEGs and other areas. So that could be the hypothalamus and such. Now this really affects donor donation because there's a dead donor rule. The individual has to be dead prior to harvesting the organs. But vital organs, the person has to be kept artificially respirated with cardiovascular functions, at least in order to keep these viable. And without going into all the criteria, if that is true, that we might be actually causing the death of individuals who have consciousness, they have tried to change the definition of brain death to exclude the hypothalamus, which is kind of odd. But nonetheless, I'll leave it at that. So we have to realize that suffering and death, they bring about anxiety and fear. Simply prolonging one's biological life doesn't satisfy the anxiety. Technology has nothing to do really to reducing anxiety. And although we've been living longer, our wellness is the wellness of a 70 or 80-year-old is not really any greater than the wellness of a 70 or an 80-year-old back prior to World War II. So we're not having the same. We may have a longer life expectancy, but we're not having that quality of life that's there. So human life is mortal. That's an obvious statement. It's often the last accepted by human persons. But nonetheless, our society has developed this cult of health, right? So what I mean by that is health has become a good above all other goods, spiritual, family, community, and such. It's not just that you want to take care of yourself, but what you're taking care of yourself for a reason, not simply for the sake of health in itself. So in that way, idol worship, can actually fall into play here. It manifests itself either this idealistic, pursuit of health, your obsessive nutrition, compulsive exercise, doing what's beyond necessary for our own human flourishing, or even, if you're in a specific occupation or sport, that's different. But people's fixation on life expectancy. Now, how does this affect in the life issues? Is that it promotes this unrealistic hope in modern medicine that always conceives as medicine curing everything. So there's always a fix, right? All elements are replacing due diligence on our part with participation in maintaining physical and mental health. So it's health care. It's not always health cure. And it's nearly universal that, we wish, quality for our own health. That's sensible, right? But quality of life, that's a very uncertain, there's some uncertain meaning in that phrase. It's highly subjective. And it tends to view the term person in terms of utility and cognition. I want to be able to do this. If I can't do that, then I don't want, my life to go on. Even though those are serious things, they don't encapsulate the depth of human dignity. So, the moral good of health lies in between withholding basic health care or life-sustaining measures and pursuing, overzealous, heroic measures that just simply delay the finality of life and our entrance, quite frankly, into union with the Trinity. Then euthanasia, from a secular point of view, this then appears to be the ultimate choice of freedom, right? It's the largest sense of freedom I have to choose how I leave this planet. So I want to choose to die in order not to suffer. So euthanasia is this, it's an act, could be an omission, which is of itself, by intention, causes death in order to alleviate suffering. Now, if it's voluntary, allowing oneself to be murdered, or involuntary, that's being murdered against one's will. But it could also be passive, like withdrawing or withholding treatment, or it could be active, like, in other words, I want the means to end my own life, such as an overdose and such. So voluntary active is typically what we would call physician-assisted suicide. But the difference between allowing one to die and euthanasia is the moral object. The moral object of allowing one to die is just that. It allows oneself or another to simply accept the legitimate finality of our lives. But with the moral object of euthanasia, that's purposely to end one's life, even if it's a good intention, which we wouldn't argue about. With end-of-life care, this has to be part of the conversation, and it's prior to the end of the life event, right? So, not trying to be obvious, but there's nothing inherently wrong with living wills. But they're not always satisfactory ways to ensure that your wishes are in line with Catholic ethical guidelines. So we have to be very cautious. They're necessarily general, and they're merely hypothetical. And they can't always account, just with the yes or no, for a lot of the unforeseen circumstances. And if I had more time, I would explain how, a 50-50 chance may not be worth it, and I can give you specifics and case studies, may not be worth it when that's the one choice, but when that choice then becomes only a matter of 3 weeks, if you don't do something, all of a sudden the 50-50 chance is worth living beyond the 3 weeks. So it gets a little difficult calculating percentages in terms of expected outcomes. It's very problematic, right? To say this operation has a 90% chance of success with a 50% chance of recovery over the following weeks, how do you measure that against other health issues that might also be present? An unbiopsied tumor, or the advanced age of a patient, you have an infected port. So advanced directives, maybe a little bit better, than simply the living will, but they have to specify the wishes of the Catholic bioethical guidelines to be followed, along with the healthcare proxy. That's the best way. You have somebody who's familiar with this and a durable power of attorney, so they can ensure that the directives will be honored in the surest way, remaining in line with your ethical choices. The DNR, the Do Not Resuscitate orders, they're not problematic ethically, typically, but you should know that they're often overridden by spouses and children and such. So a proxy there present, and at least one with legal control, is really best to take care of these ethical concerns. Now, one last thing I want to talk about here real quick is the mental health issue, which is often not something covered in a morality course. And I'm absolutely not going to be exhaustive here. I'm sure you're glad of that. First of all, mental illness is a very broad category. So the state of good mental health is not the same as the absence of mental illness, any more than the state of peace is simply the absence of conflict. And that's, something that you could, I think, easily understand. Even the American Psychiatric Association, it talks about 19% of U.S. adults experience some form of mental illness. That's 1 in 5. But there's a lot we could say about that particular interpretation. 4.1 have serious mental illnesses, 8.5 have some substance use disorder. So mental illness typically involves the effective functioning in our daily activities, and it results, whether it's productive activities, work, school, caregiving, our, healthy relationships, our ability to adapt and change and cope with adversity, which life is full of, right? And mental illnesses often result from the faulty development, perhaps in the use of sensitive and affective capacities. So physical and psychological impairments, they can contribute to the faulty development and the function because they inhibit the adaptive capacities of human persons. So as human persons, we have this affective capacity for joy and sorrow, love and use, honor, fear, etc. But as human persons and as incarnate beings, many of these have affection. Many of these affections they are initiated by corporal means, right? And the affections can likewise manifest in the body. Now, this isn't saying that we're just making it up, but what happens to the mind happens to the body. What happens to the body happens to the mind. So, what are the ethical problems in mental therapy? Well, in terms of behavior control, any medically indicated treatments or procedures, they can't be initiated without a person's consent. There could be no form of treatment used that's going to destroy human freedom. If the behavior control is therapeutic, the benefit of the patient must be the purpose of the action. And can be no damage or risk. If there is, it can only be accidental to the therapeutic action, right? Not intended. And you always have to consider long-term effects. Now, there's always a concern within this for codependency and the use of insight therapies. They raise some series of ethical issues, which could include, therapeutic transference, violation of trust, gratification of the treatment over the patient's benefit, risk of falling in love, and so on and so on. But the goals of therapy must be related to higher social and spiritual goods. So here we are back to the understanding of the human person. Clients should trust a therapist as, omnipotent parents, perhaps not so much, but only for their limited skills. And this is important, that when the client is sufficiently free emotionally, that they should seek guidance, at the ethical and spiritual levels. So not all issues that affect us psychologically are simply psychologically, they could be spiritual. So spiritual guidance may not be a substitute for clinical mental care, but also clinical mental care is not a substitute either for spiritual disorders. So we live in a society where everybody thinks we should feel well, and usually that means always. And if we don't feel well, then we think something is wrong. Does this mean feeling well at any cost? What I mean is that the therapeutic system chosen, or the practitioner, may have a built-in set of values or ideologies that they inculcate into the therapy. It could be that they see sexual relations as permissible as long as they're consensual, or breaking ties with family members that just appear to be slightly toxic or adverse to one's well-being. They may encourage seeking guiltless lifestyles. Now, there's a lot that can go on here. I'm just trying to mention a few things without being exhaustive. And if each person is to expect to feel well always, then there's going to be another ethical concern, that each person will be the one who lives for a constant succession of intensely satisfying experiences, right, without any drive to realize some plan or the ultimate goal. So it's a question to ask, a fair question to ask, if psychoanalysis could be used to produce autonomous, hedonistic, goalless, conscienceless persons. I know that sounds like a lot, and perhaps I should have said it without offering some backing to it, but perhaps we could do that within the course itself. So let me just say it this way so I can put a spiritual tone to it. Sorrow is necessary for joy, and further, sorrow is often a sign of our inherent relationality. When you're sad, you're giving me a sign to draw me into you. This doesn't apply, perhaps, to clinically, to serious clinical determined mental illnesses. But I'm commenting that we are in a very overly therapeutic society that thinks happiness as contentment should be boundless, and anything less is an illness. Nonetheless, I want to mention these two things. First, transhumanism. Transhumanism, anything from anti-aging issues, artificial intelligence, as long as it's restorative, like a person who has lost their lower limbs and blades are put on so that they could run and such. But when we start talking in terms of what is the ideal human, at what point do we start asking the question, what is it that you think the ideal human is? In other words, it's interesting that within bioethics, many people talk about transhumanism, which again isn't a half bad thing, but we're talking about the ability to go beyond that which is human. And are we doing this for purely therapeutic reasons, or are we doing this because we're trying to create something better than what we have? Would you want a human that can live 160 years? I'm going to leave it at that. It's going to be something you're going to be hearing in the next decade or so. The last thing is artificial wombs. The reality is that we have artificial reproduction. So we can have the sperm and the ovum fertilize and then implant it into the womb. But within the decade, and it's hard to be predictive, it's not unlikely that we have artificial wombs. In Philadelphia, they have already brought a lamb through 3 months of gestation in an artificial womb. Now, it wasn't conceived in this, if you want to say, this bag of embryonic fluid, but that's a possibility in the future, which is going to really do a couple things. It's going to remove not just reproduction from directly from the human conjugal act, but it's going to remove even gestation from the human person. It's also going to really undermine the abortion issue, because at that point there's still bodily autonomy issues, but it could be in the future that a fetus at any stage is going to be viable, provided it could be safely withdrawn and placed into an artificial womb. I'd like to really talk more about this. Perhaps we'll do this in the class, but I want to leave it there. All of this and the underlying issue is that the human person has to never be used, if I want to say it awkwardly, right, as a means to an end. The human person themselves are mysteries, and under no circumstances could one human person or even a human person be used to achieve something that is not for an inherent good within that individual. Thank you for listening.